¿Listo? 50 seconds.
All right, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm here to introduce Professor Penny Goldberg, who will be delivering the Econometric Society presidential address. Penny is currently the Elihu Professor of Economics at Yale. She is an extremely accomplished economist. Her work spans the fields of international trade, IO, development. She has published her work very well and has written very influential pieces. She is the former editor of the American Economic Review, one of the very best journals of economics. She is also the former chief economist at the World Bank and is currently the president of the Econometric Society. So without further ado, I would like to invite Penny Goldberg to give her presidential address. Thank you very much, Penny.
Thank you very much, Rafael, for this very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be giving this address virtually in Latin America. I would have enjoyed it even more if I could do this in person, but unfortunately, this was not meant to be this year. So hopefully next year, the president of the Econometric Society can come in person. This talk is going to be about demand side constraints in development. So let me start by giving you an idea of what the title is about and an overview of the talk. Unfortunately, my screen froze, so let me unfreeze it. Okay. So the motivation for the work that underlies this talk is the observation that there seems to be, across the world, there seems to be a quest for a new vision for development. And there are, of course, many different models of growth and development and many different taxonomies or theories of development. But for the purpose of this talk, it will be useful to adopt a taxonomy that Danny Roderick suggested in a book he published in 2016. And Danny argues that we can classify all theories of development into two broad groups. The first is the group of models that view development as a process of structural transformation. And there the idea is that there are two sectors in an economy, a low productivity sector and a high productivity sector. So typically this is identified with agriculture and manufacturing, but it doesn't have to be. And development is about reallocating resources from the low to the high productivity sector. And then there is an alternative group of theories that we can think of as focusing on fundamentals. And by fundamentals here, I mean the importance of human capital, infrastructure, institutions. And here the idea is that a country can make some long-run investments in these factors, and these are going to pay off in the long run. It may take a long time, but eventually good things will happen in this economy. And needless to say, I do not view this explanation as being competing. You know, in reality, both forces are in effect. However, rather than thinking about those as being structural transformation and fundamentals, I think, again, for the purpose of this talk, is useful to be thinking about them as the first one emphasizing demand side factors. So somehow this economy has to create the demand for the goods produced by this high productivity sector. And the second group I will think of as being supply side factors, so factors that focus on improving the supply side of the economy. And there is a very large literature in development, of course, on both groups of theories. There is an especially large literature and recent emphasis on supply side constraints. You can read the chapter in the Handbook of Economic Growth, the chapter by Banerjee and Law that's very informative on these issues. And I personally, when I was at the World Bank that Rafael mentioned, I put a lot of effort in taking steps to improve human capital, infrastructure, and so on. So I do believe in fundamentals very much. However, the thesis of this talk is that the main constraints developing countries face these days are on the demand side, not on the supply side. And these constraints have become binding as the old paradigm of structural transformation is under strain today. And specifically, I will argue that the small market size is becoming a binding constraint in low-income countries, and especially Africa. So when I talk today, I will have mostly poor countries in Africa in mind, but the arguments also apply to other low-income countries where poverty rates are still very high. So in some sense, you can think of the point that I'm going to make as being parallel to a point that Larry Summers has been making over the last few years, where he's argued that in advanced economies, the main constraint is the weak growth in aggregate demand, and he calls that secular stagnation. So I'm going to make the same point that demand is an important constraint these days, but I will make it in a very different context, namely in the context of low-income countries. So briefly, what is the structural transformation paradigm? So in the traditional structural transformation paradigm, resources move from agriculture to industry, to manufacturing, and then to services. And services, the growth of services, is typically accompanied also by urbanization. In this process, openness, trade, and export-led industrialization play a very important role. And therefore, the demand side is not a constraint. So if you think about large economies, such as India or China, these are very large countries. The domestic market size is large enough to support development. But if you have smaller economies, to the extent that these are open to trade, open to global markets, they can tap into more lucrative markets of high-income countries. These are obvious destinations for the products they produce. That generates export revenue. So this way, they can effectively increase their market size. And at the same time, this export revenue can be used for investments in these fundamentals I talked about before, in human capital, infrastructure, and so on. And needless to say that the reality is much more complex than the stylized models, the stylized view that I presented. That this is a point that Doug Golin, and along with many co-authors have made over the years, that if you try to formally test any of these paradigms, any of these models, you'll reject them. Nevertheless, I will argue that broadly speaking, the experience in East Asia in the last few decades, so China, South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, roughly conforms to this paradigm. This paradigm where structural transformation played an important role, and trade was part of this. Now, what is different today? So why am I saying that today this model is under strain? So today we have three main developments. The first is automation, so the substitution of low-skill labor by robots. So this poses a threat for the traditional advantage, the comparative advantage that low-income countries have had in low-skill intensive products, in low-wage intensive products. Second, we see worldwide a backlash against globalization and the rise of economic nationalism in advanced countries. And that means these lucrative high-income markets that I talked about before, they may not be there for developing countries today. And finally, one phenomenon that has been documented is what Danny again called premature deindustrialization. And that refers to the fact that we see, mainly in countries in Africa, we see an allocation of resources from agriculture to services. So many countries skip the stage of manufacturing. And so that has led to this belief that when I was at the World Bank, it was particularly pronounced that perhaps services can play the same role that manufacturing has played in the past and lead growth. However, the experience on the role of services today tends to be much more mixed and I would say disappointed. Again, Golin, Jedwab, and Folrath have a paper that they call Urbanization Without Industrialization, and there they make the point that in Africa, we've seen the emergence of many cities, which, however, do not have this high productivity that other big cities in developing countries have had in the past. And that led them to distinguish between consumption and production services. And they make the point that consumption services, okay, so having, for example, drivers for your cars, building houses and so on, all these services do not have these positive features that we associate with a high productivity sector. Production services, on the other hand, do, so it's a very nuanced picture. And along the same lines, my colleagues, Michael Peters and Fabrizio Cilibotti, along with a graduate student at Yale, have asked the question, is growth, they look at India, which is a country that has been growing very fast, and they ask the question, is growth in India service-led or service-biased? So in other words, we see growth of services in India, but is that what's behind the growth in India, or are services the result of growth? And the answer, again, in this case is very nuanced. So today there is no clear evidence that services can be the new manufacturing. So continuing with the motivation, the motivation for this paper was the following observation. We can look at a country like India. India has been growing very fast in the last few decades. We can argue about the exact number, but most would agree, most economists would agree that there has been fast growth. And most economists would also agree that the growth has not been driven by manufacturing or exports. So that leads to the hypothesis that if you have a country like India with a large domestic market, so perhaps in this case, the country does not need trade or manufacture or exports to develop. So it faces a very different reality from a small economy that is closed. And the reason for that is that there is a potential to realize internal economies of scale. So as long as this economy adopts the right policies, these internal economies of scale can be realized. Now, you can immediately think of a counterexample, Nigeria, also a very large country and extremely rich in natural resources. And Nigeria has had periods of fast growth and poverty reduction, but there has been no sustained poverty reduction and no sustained development. And by making this rough cross-country comparison, we came to an additional hypothesis that, namely, development requires, in addition to this big domestic side of economies of scale, it also requires a certain degree of equality. So the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Nigeria is it's an extremely unequal country where all the wealth of the country is held in the hands of very few. Development requires a certain degree of equality, so that if you have a positive shock, let's say oil exports or an increase in agricultural productivity, this shock can trickle down, generate a middle class. This middle class has purchasing power, and this way that can generate multiplier effects and foster growth. So in this story, equality, a certain degree of equality, is a prerequisite for development in the very early stages of development. So this, this paradigm that I just described seems plausible for some countries, but of course it raises many questions. So the first is, how do we operationalize this idea, and how do we try to bring evidence to the hypothesis? What does a large market mean in this context? So in other words, how large does a market need to be for this mechanism of internal economies to be relevant? What does equality mean in this context? What is development? And finally, what is a small country supposed to do if trade is not an option? So that's a question that many African countries face today. And so that led us to develop a conceptual framework for thinking about these issues. And so what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is I will present you an outline of this conceptual framework and some evidence. By the way, when I say we here, I mean my co-author, Tristan Reed of the World Bank, and myself. What I'm going to present is based on a working paper called Income Distribution, International Immigration and Sustained Poverty Reduction. It's available on our websites. And just to give you a very brief overview, the theoretical framework we use is inspired by a paper by Murphy, Schleifer, and Vishny in 1989. So this is not their famous big push paper at the JP. This is a different paper, which I think is very relevant to the reality of low-income countries today. And that paper itself is a formalization of earlier ideas by several developing economists. So most important, Arthur Lewis, who provided several writings in 1953, 54, 67. These writings did not provide formal were there. So this theoretical framework gives rise to an empirical threshold crossing model. For those of you who are in industrial organization, who have a background in industrial organization, this model is going to be very similar to the Bresnahan and Dries model on entry in perfectly competitive markets. So I will explain shortly what I mean by that. So you can think of our framework as marrying the work of Murphy et al. With the IO literature. We estimate the model using panel data from multiple countries, and then we use it to calculate, among other things, how large a large market needs to be in order to benefit from domestic economies of scale, what is the role of trade versus domestic market size, and so on. So the main takeaways, in case I run out of time, which I always do, the first takeaway is that trade is essential for the development of smaller economies. So this did not start as a project on trade. Nevertheless, this is a message that comes out of this work very strongly. And just to give you an idea, the threshold for development we estimate in the case of autarky. So this is just a thought experiment. We don't really think that the world is moving towards autarky, but if we didn't have trade, countries would have to have at least 300 million people to develop on their own. So this is a very large threshold that in some sense, you can say this is not surprising. Personally, I'm Greek. Greece is a small country. And the first thing you learn in elementary school in first grade is that the key to the ancient Greek civilization was trade with the rest of the world at the time. But nevertheless, I would say this is a message that we seem to be forgetting these days. And so I think it's good to remind people how important trade is in general, but especially for small economies. The second message is that in the absence of trade, or in the presence of less trade than we are used to, a certain degree of equality is crucial for growth. Why? Because equality effectively increases market size. So therefore growth and equality are complements in early stages of development. And finally, in the absence of global trade, deep integration under a regional umbrella could increase effective market size and aid development. So now let me give you a roadmap of the rest of the talk. I will start by presenting the theoretical framework. Then I'll discuss very briefly some conceptual issues. What I'm going to present is a very stylized model, a very stylized view of the world. So it's natural to ask the question of what does it mean to take this theory to the data. So then I will talk about the empirical implementation of this framework. So I will talk about the empirical framework and some measurement issues, then the results and the conclusions. And needless to say, I do not have much time to get into the details, but I hope that you'll be motivated to actually read the paper that provides more details. So here's the theoretical framework. So we start with the assumption of a small open economy. There are three sectors: agriculture, you can think of this as food, manufacturing, and then there is a third sector that can be a cash crop or minerals. I put open in quotes, and the reason is there is some trade in this country in the sense that this country exports the cash crop or it exports this mineral, but there is no trade in manufactures. So it exports this mineral, and in return, it imports food. So that's the extent to which this economy has trade, but there is no trade, as I said, in manufacturers. There are no services in this model, but in principle, one could easily extend it and treat services just like manufacturing. Needless to say, this is highly stylized, but I would argue that to a certain extent, it captures some of the realities of low-income countries today. So especially in Africa, we have countries that are very rich in minerals or natural resources. They have oil, they have diamonds, they export those, they are not used for domestic consumption. And in return, they import food. And by the way, cash crop has played the same role in the past. For example, in Latin America, at its initial stages of development, coffee exports played the same role in Colombia. In manufacturing, there are two technologies. There is the traditional technology, the constant returns to scale technology, and then there is a new increasing returns to scale technology. And development in this framework or is equal to industrialization. So it's identified as the transition from the constant returns to scale to the increasing returns to scale technology. So here you can see the structural transformation framework. There is duality. There is the CRS sector and the IRS sector. And again, development is identified with a transition of resources from the CRS sector to the IRS sector. There is a large discussion in the literature why increasing returns to scale are linked to development. So let me skip this discussion here. But I would say that empirically, there is a lot of evidence that the adoption of these increasing returns to scale technologies that allow for mass production are closely linked to development. In the world of the model, this new technology increases productivity and wages and reduces poverty. However, this technology, the adoption of this increasing returns to scale technology has a fixed cost. And that implies you need a minimum threshold of market size to adopt this technology. That's how market size comes in this model. Now, this threshold market size can in turn be achieved in two ways. You can use the domestic size, the domestic market size. So that would be the case in a large country, or you can use the international market. If you're going to use the domestic market, the role of middle class is crucial. And what is middle class here? So middle class in this model refers to the consumers who are above the subsistence level, but below the level at which luxury goods are consumed. So you can think, if you think about the consumption patterns of this economy, there are the very poor consumers with income less than Z. So these consumers buy just food. Then there is the upper class. The upper class buys food, mass-produced goods, but they also buy luxury goods or luxury imports. And these luxury goods are produced with these constant returns to scale technology. And then between the two, there is this middle class. And what's special about this middle class is they use the first Z units of their income to buy food, but then they use the rest to buy industrial goods. These are goods that are mass produced. These are goods that are produced using these increasing returns to scale technology. So the role of middle class has, of course, been emphasized many times before in development. And again, I will refer you to a paper by Banerjee and Duflo in 2008 that focuses exactly on this question: why is middle class so important for development? And broadly speaking, one can come up with three explanations why the middle class is important. The first is that the middle class tend to consist of people with entrepreneurial instinct, and entrepreneurs are good for development. The second explanation is that middle class tend to have the right values for development. They tend to save more. They tend to value education. So that's all good for development. But then there's a third explanation, and this is what's going on in this model. The middle class here is important because of its purchasing power. Okay, so that's the role of middle class in our model. And specifically, the middle class here is a source of pure profit for this increasing returns to scale firm, this monopolist who produces these goods. So one can show that the upper class pays the fixed cost of the technology, and then they consume luxury goods. But then it's the middle class that buys these mass-produced goods, generating profits for those who hold stock in the increasing returns to scale technology. Okay. So the larger the middle class, the more profits are distributed to the middle class, the higher is the fraction of these profits that comes back as consumption in this economy. Right. So the fraction of profits in the hands of the middle class determines, in other words, the extent of spillovers and multiplier effects. in this country. So it sets off a virtuous process through which the middle class aids development. So in this context, when does industrialization and development fail? Okay, why do we see poverty? So there are the following explanations. The first is that an economy could be too poor. So there are no rents, there are no profits, and therefore it's impossible to develop an increasing returns to scale sector. So in this case, a wealth boost may help, and this is what Lewis in 1953 thought as a source of a wealth boost was agriculture. That's why many papers see agriculture as the leading sector. So an increase in agricultural productivity raises wages and rents and creates this wealth boost and starts this process of shifting labor from agriculture to manufacturing. The same can be achieved through export of cash crops, right? That's why exports here could potentially be important. So in some sense here, the exports of the cash crop or the exports of oil play exactly the same role of agricultural productivity. And I would argue that this constraint of an economy being too poor at the outset is perhaps not that relevant today. So if you think about countries in Africa, as I said earlier, most of them are very rich in natural resources. Notably, Africa has not experienced the Green Revolution the same way Brazil experienced it, or India. So this increase in agricultural productivity has not taken place in Africa. However, many countries are very rich in oil, in diamonds, in other natural resources, and all these resources generate this initial wealth boost. The second reason that I think is more relevant today is that the economy is too unequal, and that can mean two things. You can have an oligarchical wealth structure, so the wealth is held by very few people. And if the wealth is held by very few people, again, there is no scope for adopting an increasing returns to scale technology. So there are not enough people to pay the fixed cost of the technology. The other possibility is that you have a middle class that's not sufficiently large. So in principle, one can cover the fixed cost, but this virtuous process I talked about before, with multiplier effects, this process never gets started. Now also note that all these constraints are less relevant if there is free trade, because the market size is determined by the size of the international market, right? So trade can actually compensate for the smallness of the domestic market. So all these considerations are more important if you have a closed economy. So what are the implications for development? If you take a poor country, if you focus on a poor country, according to this view of the world, a poor country would need an initial boost, the wealth effect, that can come from an increase in agricultural productivity or from exports of this cash crop or other natural resources. It needs a large enough market. So in the absence of trade, this market needs to be the domestic market. And then it needs a certain degree of equality, so a middle class. Now, I cannot help it. I don't have much time, but given that my background is in trade, let me also briefly highlight what the role of trade is in this particular setup. So trade here has three functions. So the first one I already mentioned, it may create this initial wealth boost through exports. So this is related to the traditional forces of comparative advantage. If a country is rich in oil, it can export oil and import food. The second one that I didn't talk about is the following. We have this fixed cost of adopting the new technology. If there is trade in capital goods and this country imports capital goods or intermediates, that can decrease fixed costs. So it can lower the fixed cost of adopting this new technology. But most importantly is number three, and that's the meat of this model. What trade does here, it increases the market size in an open economy, and it allows the adoption of the increasing returns to scale technology. And of course, increasing returns to scale have been emphasized in trade many times before. So you can read the book by Helpman and Krugman in 1985. But here the role of increasing returns to scale is somewhat different. So traditionally in trade, people focus on the question, if we have increasing returns to scale, then what are the patterns of specialization and what are the gains from trade? Here, what I'm saying is that trade is what allows a country to adopt increasing returns to scale in the first place. So in that sense, you can think of the effect. This is a static model. This is a very stylized model, but you can think of the effect that trade has in this model as being essentially a dynamic one. So trade is what allows countries to actually adopt this increasing returns to scale technology and set off this process of industrialization. And I think that can also explain why many people have this fundamental belief that the gains from trade are very large, even though in most empirical, most quantitative work on trade that focuses on the first or second effect, people actually estimate the gains from trade to be relatively small. When I say small, I mean relative to expectations. Most of us, many people think that the gains from trade are immense. And I think the third function that trade has in this model may explain that. So now so this was the theoretical framework that I described in words. And now let me say a few words about what it means to bring this theoretical framework to the data. It's a challenge because, as you can see, it's highly stylized. We are not going to attempt to formally test the model because I think this is a hopeless undertaking. We know that the model is false. By the way, this is a point that Krugman made very well in a piece he wrote in 1994 called The Fall and Rise of Development. And I couldn't have put it better. So what Krugman says, if we are trying to use a model to describe an extremely complex system, such as an economy, then the model is by definition going to be false, because the only accurate description of this economy, or the only accurate description of this system is the system itself. Any model you use is going to employ abstraction, and by definition, it's going to be false. So we are not going to even attempt to do that. What we do is very much in the spirit of something Liemer wrote in his contribution to the Handbook of International Economics in '95, namely estimate, do not test. So what do I mean by that? So we're going to focus on the main ideas of this framework and estimate an empirical model that's inspired by this framework. I'll show you the model in a minute. And what the theory suggests is what variables should we include and in which form do they enter the empirical specification. And then we're going to look at the questions, do the estimated parameters look sensible, and do they conform to the theory, and what is also the predictive power of this framework relative to a kitchen sink approach. And in particular, we're going to focus on the following questions. What is the role of domestic versus international market size? And also the counterfactual, so how large would the domestic market have to be in the absence of international integration for a country to actually develop? So some conceptual issues. So development is, of course, a very broad term. So I think when one thinks about development, what comes to mind is, again, a statement that a judge in the United States made once about obscenity, where he said, I don't know how to define obscenity, but I know when I see it. And I think with development, it's the same thing. We know when we see it, but it's really hard to define it. In this particular framework, there is a very clear definition, namely development is the industrialization, so the adoption of this increasing returns to scale technology. But needless to say, measurement of increasing returns has been empirically elusive. And also, for our purposes, the interest is not in increasing returns to scale per se. We just, in this model, increasing returns to scale, it just means towards poverty reduction, towards development. So we need a more practical definition. So for the purpose of this paper, we identify development with sustained poverty reduction. Why sustained? Because we want to exclude temporary episodes of apparent poverty reduction arising from a commodity price boom. For example, this was the case in the past decade in Africa repeatedly. Oil prices go up or commodity prices go up for a few years, poverty goes down in this country. And then once there's a commodity price bust, the picture of poverty goes up again. So we don't think of instances like this as development. The empirical work, as I said earlier, is inspired by the industrial organization literature on entry. And the idea is the following, that in our framework, development means adopting this increasing returns to scale technology. And to adopt this technology, the economy needs to satisfy a break-even condition, namely the variable profits have to be equal to the fixed cost of adoption. Okay, so this is the break-even condition. So again, for those of you with a background in these models, this is very similar to the break-even condition in entry models. Bresnahan and Rees used this to estimate threshold market size. So for example, how large does the market size need to be for one firm to enter or for two firms to enter? Our approach here is similar in the sense that we're asking the question, how large does the market size need to be for us to see development? And what's behind it is the question, how large does the market size need to be for this increasing returns to scale technology to be adopted by a monopolist? One advantage of thinking about the break-even condition in these terms, and that applies to the entire IO literature on this subject, is that it does not require data on firms' prices or quantities. So we can rely on widely available market-level data that capture market conditions and market size. So I try to keep equations to a minimum, given that this is a keynote address. But here is very briefly the threshold crossing model that we take to the data. So the profits in the increasing returns to scale sector are given by this formula here, by this expression here. The first part here refers to variable profits. Okay, variable profits again of two terms, the market size S and the per capita variable profits B. And then there's a second term which refers to the fixed cost of adoption. Market size depends on a number of factors that I'm going to explain in a moment. The variable profits, the variable per capita profits depend on a set of demand shifters, Z, and cost shifters, W. As I said earlier, these are observable, so these are market level variables. And similarly, the fixed costs depend on a set of observables, W. The Greek letters denote parameters that we estimate. The error term here captures measurement error, which is certainly present in our case, and also all the factors that we leave out of this very simple explanation of development. And assuming that this is normally distributed, one can derive a simple probit model that we take to the data. So I said earlier that we use the theory to inform the empirical specification. So this idea that we have the break-even condition is very much informed by the model. The other aspect of the empirics that's here informed by the model is the specifics, the specifications for market size and per capita variable profits, as well as fixed costs. So for market size, we make market size a function of the following variables. There is the population, the raw population of the country, so the domestic market size. We actually measure it here as the population below middle class for reasons I will explain in a moment. Then there is the fraction of the population that's in middle class. And then we also consider the size of the international market, the integrated market. And we consider two versions of the integrated market. We can measure the integrated market in terms of population or in terms of income. So here we're going to ask the question, what happens if a country trades, if a country is open with other countries that have very large population versus opening up to countries that may not be that populous but have very high income. So this specification is very much informed by the model. Similarly, when it comes to per capita variable profits, so these are the outcome of this wealth boost in the model. So these we make a function of past export growth and past agricultural productivity growth. And then for the fixed cost, in the fixed cost, we put all these variables that work on development has shown to be very important for development. For example, many geography variables, tropical climate, desert climate, distance to coast, legal origins, British versus French legal origins. Just to jump ahead, all these are highly significant. They have predictive power, but they enter. So we do account for them in the model, but they enter the specification in a very specific way, namely as part of the fixed costs. And once we have estimated this model, then we can derive the threshold market size. This is this expression here. So this is the market size that's needed for a country in order to adopt this increasing returns to scale technology. Now, this is the framework, and still we face various measurement challenges in order to take this model to the data. So let me briefly tell you how we measure various objects here. So the first is we need to measure poverty reduction. So the way we do that is as follows. We use data from PovCalNet of the World Bank, and the data is between 81 and 2015. So we take this period and we partition it in 5-year intervals. And then we ask the question, in each 5-year interval, do we see poverty consistently declining during that time or not? And if the answer is yes, so if during this period poverty declines during all 5 years, then we assign a dummy variable that's equal to 1 to this country time interval pair, and we say during that period in that country we have poverty reduction. By the way, our work focuses only in developing countries. We exclude advanced economies because we start in 81, and obviously countries that are already high income and they have no poverty, they do not develop according to our definition. So there are many questions you can have about how everything is measured here, and there are many judgment calls. But let me show you some information about what poverty reduction looks like in our case, just to make the point that what we get is passes the smell check, seems consistent with common wisdom. So this is the poverty reduction in Asia according to our poverty measure. It's quite clear that many countries, especially China, Vietnam, India, they experience fast poverty reduction over our sampling period, in contrast to Malaysia, that is fairly steady. Contrast this picture to poverty reduction in Africa. And again, poverty reduction is based on this measure that we use, the sustained poverty reduction measure. The picture for Africa looks very different, and that's precisely what we wanted to capture with our measure. We wanted to capture the fact that in Africa we have short periods where things look good, but however, this poverty reduction is not sustained in the long run. So you can see that in some countries like Ethiopia, you have a sustained poverty reduction over some years, right? But then it becomes smaller. In some countries like the Cote d'Ivoire, poverty goes consistently up. Some other patterns that I want to briefly mention. I could spend a lot of time on this, but I think there is one I want to emphasize. Poverty reduction is highly correlated with growth, and this is precisely the reason that most economists think that the best way to reduce poverty is to support growth. So you see that clearly in this yellow, in this highlighted number here. So that table shows you that that table contrasts the periods, the instances of sustained real per capita growth to those where we have sustained extreme poverty reduction. So if you look at the cases where we have sustained poverty reduction, this is the second row here, so that's the one here. In 76% of these cases, we also have growth, sustained growth. However, there are also 24% of cases where we don't have growth. And perhaps more importantly, you can see from this purple number here that we also have many instances where you do have growth, but you don't have sustained poverty reduction. So they're highly correlated, but they're not the same. Another point I want to make very briefly is you can produce graphs that show the percentage of countries that managed to reduce poverty over the past few decades, and you can do that for the many different regions. You can see what happens in Latin America here, since this address is given to a Latin American audience. And what you see here is that you have this slowdown of poverty reduction between 85 and approximately 2000. You can also see what happens in sub-Saharan Africa, which was of interest to us. Essentially no poverty reduction until the late 90s, and then fast poverty reduction. Second, we need to measure market size. And let me first tell you how we measure international market size. So we measure international market size based on signed international trade agreements. So this is, very briefly, this is what international trade agreements look like. So we use information from GATT, from the WTO, from the Agreement on Government Procurement, and also preferential trade agreements. And all of these agreements have many different provisions listed here. So for every country, we ask the question, how many of these provisions are they signed in the trade agreement with another trade partner? right? And we use the share of provisions that are assigned to create weights. These weights capture the degree of integration with this other country. And then we take a country, let's say Brazil, and we take all the countries with which Brazil has trade agreements, and we sum up their population. And that gives us a measure of the total population that Brazil has access to. So it's not the unweighted sum, it's actually, as I said, it's the weighted sum. We weigh by these weights that capture the strength of the trade cooperation. And then we do the same thing with per capita income. So this way we have two different measures of the international market side. We have one measure that captures the size of the market based on population, and then we have another measure that captures the size of the market in terms of income, of per capita income. And we think that's quite interesting because it gives us two different measures, and as I'll show you in a moment, this is important. Another advantage of this, I think, is that the measure is based on trade agreements, which are actionable from a point of view of a government, so there are policy variables, and it's not based on outcomes, such as trade flows. Very briefly, I will show you one graph here, which I personally found fascinating. You can see what our measures look like for WTO member states over time. And so one feature of this measure we developed is it depends on what the country does, but it also depends on what the trade partners do. So look at what happens here. So first, the red line represents population. So over time, countries become more integrated. So the size of the integrated market in terms of population goes up. Then in 2001, China enters. And then you have a huge jump because the population of China is very large. So effectively what this means, countries, the WTO member states, get access to a much larger market through China. But look at what happens to the income per capita. In the same year, the income per capita goes down. And again, this is because the per capita income in China is lower than the per capita income of WTO, of other WTO member states. So there are these two measures can go in very different directions, and the most striking case is the case of China. You can produce these measures for every region, and which we've done in this graph. And again, the main takeaway from this, which I think speaks to some of the issues people are concerned about, is if you look at low-income countries in the early years prior to China's entry in world markets, many countries, many low-income countries, were increasing their access to countries of the world that had not only higher population, but perhaps more importantly, they had higher incomes. Okay, so you see that very, very clearly for South Asia, for example, or for Sub-Saharan Africa. So they get access to richer markets, to lucrative markets. Then China comes in, and all of a sudden, what they face is through trade, they face more competition from another country, from another low-income country at the time. So they don't get this access effect through trade, they get more competition. So that can explain a lot. How about domestic market size? So the domestic market size in our framework depends on the raw population and also on the income distribution. And it depends on the income distribution because it depends on the fraction of people who are in the global middle class. We focus on the global middle class because in this framework, the technology is global. And we define global middle class following Karas as being those people with incomes between $11 and $110 PPP dollars per day, and these are 2011 dollars. So the idea here is that the people who are in this global middle class are the people who are not poor in the relatively poor countries, in the relatively poor high-income countries, and they are not rich in the richest countries. Okay, so they are somewhere in the middle. Let me skip this because I'm running out of time and come to the main results and the main insights. So when we model, we find that the constant and fixed cost is positive and significant, which is consistent with increasing returns to scale. I mentioned before all these institutional and geographical factors that previous work has found to be important. We also find them to be incredibly important. But here they operate through a very specific channel. We employ one particular measure of fit, which is the area under the receiver operating curve. This is a measure that's used in machine learning these days. This measure is 0.735, so it's much better than a random guess. So very briefly, so this measure captures the percentage of instances where the model predicts an instance of poverty reduction or an instance of no poverty reduction correctly. Okay, so according to this measure, we do better than a random guess, and we also do slightly better than a kitchen sink approach, not significantly so, but I would say that this is at least as good as the kitchen sink. The middle class coefficient is significant and high, and implies that increasing the share of population in the global middle class by 10% is equivalent to adding 54 million people to the population. And finally, we find that the international market size is very important. That's why I said at the beginning, ultimately the conclusion is that trade is very important, but it's more important when it's measured by relative income versus relative population. And let me make the point using a very specific example. So if a country integrates with a country with the same population, this is the same as adding 160,000 people to the market size. If you integrate with a country with the same income per capita, this is like integrating 20 million people. So it's a much larger number. So as an example, consider Afghanistan. The population is 35 million. So if Afghanistan integrates to Iran, Iran has 2.3 times the population of Afghanistan. So it gets a very significant increase in market size. So this is the population equivalent. If it integrates with Pakistan, which is a much larger market in terms of population, it gets an even bigger population increase. But look at what happens if you make the same calculation based on relative incomes, per capita incomes. So Iran has 10 times the per capita income of Afghanistan. Pakistan only 3 times. So if Afghanistan integrates with Iran, this is like adding 200 million people to its economy. So it's a very significant increase in market size. If it integrates with Pakistan, this is like adding 60 million. So again, this reinforces the point that trade is important, but it's particularly important and particularly beneficial to low-income countries if it's traded with high-income countries. We estimate the threshold market size to be 328 people. So you can think of these as being raw people, not in the middle class. So needless to say, this is a very high number that most countries, with the exceptions of China and India, cannot achieve. But in our case, it can be achieved through raw population, but it can also be achieved by increasing the middle class or by international integration. And finally, let me conclude with a graph that gives you some sense of how important these effects are. So here we ask the question, what would happen if countries stay at the current level of integration? These are the blue bars here. And what would the world look like? What would poverty reduction look like if we had autarky? And again, we don't think the world is going towards autarky, but this is a thought experiment that allows us to identify the role of trade and report the results by deciles of GDP per capita. So the one point to make is that you have to reach the 6th decile of the income of the GDP per capita distribution for countries to be capable of reducing poverty on their own, without being connected to international markets. At current levels of integration, so this is the blue bars, the picture looks much better. So except for the first decile, most countries are on track to actually reduce poverty. You can do this exercise very briefly for many different countries, but I don't have time to go over these results. So just to summarize and conclude, for a small country, it's nearly impossible to eliminate poverty if it's closed. The size of the domestic market can compensate for lack of trade, but our estimates suggest that the domestic market size has to be huge for this effect to kick in. So what is a small country supposed to do these days? So one possibility is deep integration. That said, we haven't seen that anywhere in the world, so not even in the European Union, which is perhaps the most integrated part of the world. Alternatively, a certain degree of equality in the sense that a country forces the development of the large middle class can compensate for the small market size. So to conclude, in the current policy environment, a certain degree of equality is actually a complement and not a substitute for growth. And I will stop here. Thank you very much, and sorry for running a little late.
Oh, thank you very much, Penny, for the very insightful lecture. I can see here that I don't have many questions on my chat, but you should feel free to send questions. Well, if there are no questions, I can start with a few, if you don't mind. So Penny, I mean, this is a very stylized and abstract model, as you mentioned. But if you could, I at the very beginning, I could not help myself and try to ground things into the real world. And if I understand correctly, I mean, industrialization here means adoption of an increasing maturity to scale. And what exactly do you have in mind here? Are you thinking about manufacturing and all these arguments that manufacturing leads to spillovers and external increasing returns? Or are you thinking about something a bit broader that maybe can be services and not necessarily manufacturing? And why there's a fixed cost of adopting this technology? Could you help me ground things a bit more?
Yes, that's a very good question. So traditionally, people have identified this increasing returns to scale technology with manufacturing and specifically to mass production in manufacturing. Why does it take fixed costs? Because if you're going to produce goods such as, let's say, washing machines or cars, the idea for increasing returns to scale to kick in, you need to pay a fixed cost. And once you've paid the fixed cost, the per unit costs are declining in production. Now, as I said, I don't think that there is scope for specialization in manufacturing to play this role in the future in most countries. However, services could play this role, not all services, but a very specific kind of services, namely what Golin et al. Call production services. So therefore, I don't want to tie my hands and think of this IRS sector as being the manufacturing sector. I would think of it more generally as being all technologies, all markets that exhibit this feature. You have to pay a fixed cost. It could be in terms of facilities, it could be in terms of plants, or in terms of services, it could be in terms of education, or in terms of digital technology that you have to invest in. And once you do that, then the per unit cost goes down, and then this virtuous process sets in. So I think these days this process may be more relevant to services, but not all services, a very specific kind of services. And along these lines, if you think of, if you consider what happened in many African countries, so Nigeria comes to place, there was this boost that I talked about before, this wealth boost through oil exports, right? And then that started, there were some spillovers, right? There was more construction. The rich people, those who benefited from the oil revenues, started building houses. There was more demand for construction materials. Then they need to buy cars. As they buy more cars, they need drivers. So there is to a certain extent higher demand arising from this wealth shock. However, what has happened in this case is all these services were not productive services. So driving a car, being a driver to a rich person is not something that is going to aid development. Learning how to program digital services play a very different role. So that's how I think about it.
Oh, thank you, Penny. As you were answering my question, many questions came in at the same time. So let me ask you a question that Roman Zarate sent. He's asking about whether you have looked into counterfactuals that look into other policies, such as industrial policies, for instance.
I'm sorry, which policies?
Industrial policies.
No, I mean, the short answer is no, because industrial policy is not in this framework, or other specific policies, but somewhat related. So I guess no one asked, or I don't know if people ask this question, but one comment I sometimes get, and I think it's a very justified comment, is very specifically in the context of Latin America. People say, well, poverty went down in Latin America, primarily because there was a very aggressive social protection initiative in many countries. And this social protection that actually eliminated poverty. And I agree, but at some point you have to ask yourself the question, how can a government pay for these problems? Or how can a government finance industrial policy? It needs an initial, increase in the per capita income, an initial boost in development before there is the fiscal capacity or the state capacity to engage in additional policies. So I think of this model as being mostly relevant to very early stages of development.
Okay, so I have another question here. It's a little long, so I'm going to read the question. Economic inequality and the lack of middle class coexist with political capture by a small elite. This elite probably loses from the type of policies that are implied by your model. How can we overcome this huge political obstacle to development via more trade and growth of the middle class and reduction of inequality?
That's a good question. Actually, in our model, the rich, so those who hold the wealth, they don't necessarily lose from development. However, and that's where I think the question brings up a very important point. If you ask me the very specific policy question, so how do we make sure that this domestic middle class is large enough to support development? What do you need to do in terms of a specific policy? The first thing that comes to mind is redistribution, and not just redistribution of income, but redistribution of wealth, right? Obviously, there's going to be tremendous opposition to that. So in our model, the best way to change, to jumpstart this process is to redistribute wealth, to redistribute land, right? Or to redistribute those who have the rights to exports. Clearly, there would be enormous opposition to doing something like that. I don't have an easy answer, but I will just say the following, that I think the first step is to realize that this redistribution, that more equality, is actually good for development under the circumstances I just described. And I think there is a very large number of people who still believe that there is a tension between equality and growth, that any measure you take to redistribute resources or make a country more equal is detrimental to growth. And I hope that what this work will suggest to many is that there are many instances that are especially relevant today where this is not the case. And I think this is the first step.
Thank you, Penny. The other question here is that you didn't mention much, you didn't talk much about, capital or human capital or even institutions. Could you elaborate a little bit on these points?
Yeah, so as I said before, this is the alternative explanation, which is not here. I think these are very important. Actually, institutions are taken into account through the fixed costs. And what I mean by that is we do control for legal origins, whether they are British or French. We do account for a bunch of geography variables, which again have been linked to the emergence of institutions. So I think institutions are controlled to a certain extent. And in principle, one could also put more things in these fixed costs, for example, human capital. But human capital is not the source of development here. And as I said at the beginning, this is not because I think human capital is not important, and similarly, investments in infrastructure, they're very important to development. However, I think a lot of the work has focused on human capital, ignoring the fact that perhaps that's not the biggest constraint these days. And just to be more specific of what I mean, when I joined the World Bank, all the emphasis was on human capital and infrastructure to a certain extent. And I think this is wonderful. And as I said, I supported it. But that also raised two questions. One was, how were investments in in human capital going to be paid for, right? So who is going to pay for increasing the human capital of a particular country? You also need to have some vision of a process that is going to generate development and revenue independent of human capital. So that's one. The second one is that all these investments in human capital, infrastructure, institutions, again, they're very important. They take a very long time to show results. And from a political economy point of view that was just mentioned, you need to ask yourself, how can a government stay in power by taking the position that we're going to invest in human capital or infrastructure, but the population has to wait for 10 to 20 years to see a better future. This is politically not feasible. People want to see results much sooner. People need jobs. People need employment. So that's why I said at the beginning, I don't see these explanations as competing with each other. One needs to do both. But the view that investing in human capital or investing just in infrastructure is sufficient is, in my view, unrealistic, because people want to see results and people need jobs much faster.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we're over time. So I'd like to thank Penny very much for inspirational presidential lecture. And thank you all for staying with us.
Thank you, Rafael. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.